we've all had different relationships with experimenting with drugs, and some people go from experiment. I mean, everybody's got a different reason why they do what they do. I mean, there's a reason why there's a million reasons why, I guess, people become alcoholics. Everybody's got, with you, it was a void you were trying to fill. Who knows? Everybody's got a different reason. Usually it ties back to trauma or not feeling worthy or not feeling loved or whatever that is. Those are things that I think are common amongst addicts.
This is the Knockin Doorz Down podcast. Jason LaChance here, a commercial-free version of this conversation. Hey, I want to tell you I've got some exciting news on things that I'm doing, and I'd appreciate you following me there. I am going to be producing and sometimes co-hosting a new podcast that's showing to be very successful, and it's in the same wheelhouse. It's called We're Out of Time with Richard Tate.
The We're Out of Time podcast with Richard Tate, featuring two-time NBA champion Lamar Odom.
You were in a coma, right?
For 3 days. They told me I wasn't even going to talk again, let alone walk.
Musician and social media influencer Andrea Russett.
As of today, 2 weeks.
Star of Netflix Tall Girl Ava Michelle.
The next morning, I found him, and
You found him?
I did find him.
Personal stylist Parker Noriega.
These kind of doctors, majority of the time, are yes doctors.
Ken Kraft, the founder of Hope the Mission.
I had my own broken world experience. I lost everything.
On the We're Out of Time podcast with the man who revolutionized addiction treatment, Richard Tate. Subscribe now on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Richard is one of the premier individuals in addiction, treatment, and recovery. And he started the We're Out of Time podcast. I'm producing it. I'm going to be co-hosting. He's had so many amazing guests, celebrities talking about their addiction struggles, recovery, mental health, and so much more. Please give it a follow. The link is in the podcast description, youtube.com/@RichardTate. Or if you're listening to the podcast, search for We're Out of Time, and you'll find the podcast there. And you'll be hearing and seeing me on there, so if you want to remain connected with me, that's the place to do it. Or some of you may know that I do work for PAIN, Parents and Addicts in Need, a nonprofit helping those and their families through the process of addiction and recovery. And I've included links for all that and the podcast that we do called Don't Hide the Scars down below in the description. And I put my email there as well. I've had so many people reach out through Knockin Doorz Down asking to be connected to services, and that is the best way to get a hold of me, jason@painnonprofit.org. All right, we're going commercial free here on out. Mr. Eric Bischoff, thank you for joining me on Knockin Doorz Down.
Happy to be here, man.
Eric hosted 83 Weeks, Strictly Business. You can get all those at ad-free shows. We'll dig into that more a little bit later on, but your latest book, Grateful, just came out. What a poignant title to kind of pick up after Controversy Creates Cash.
Yeah, I mean, a lot's gone down since 2006, I think, is when Controversy Creates Cash came out, 2006 or 2007. So, yeah, man, it's been a fun 16 years, interesting 16 years. Lots of it has been fun, but some of it's just been more on the interesting side.
I'm an avid listener of 83 Weeks. I think the only episode I've never completed was the Scott Hall episode, and I'll go into that a little bit later on. But you're working with Guy Evans on this book. Of course, was the writer of the Nitro book, one that sticks to fact. Why was that so important to this relationship for you? You do talk on 83 Weeks about trust and.
Well, I mean, you said it, man. It's trust. And I think anytime you're going to sit down and share, I don't want to say intimate details because there's nothing intimate about it, I guess, in the typical use of the word intimate, but I was sharing thoughts that had nothing to do with the wrestling business, or my experiences in the wrestling business, or stories from the road, or any of the typical things that people like me who've spent a couple minutes in the wrestling industry talk about. This was more about what was inside of my head and what was inside of my heart. And that's a different conversation. And I wouldn't sit down and share those kinds of details or experiences with people that I didn't necessarily feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And in order for me to feel comfortable with somebody, I have to have a certain level of trust. Guy Evans, I didn't know Guy at all before he wrote the book, the Nitro book. And I interviewed with him for that book, which is something I don't normally do with people I don't know, because you never know how much integrity a writer has or what their agenda is, particularly when people are writing or talking about wrestling, because it's such a passionate, subjective universe that people tend to take little bits of information and they spin it and turn it and use it to kind of create or support their own narratives or agenda. But when I read Guy's book, I was so impressed with his integrity, and that integrity was reflected in his research and the effort that he put into that book. Guy did over 120 interviews with people, some of whom I've never even met, people that were above me on the corporate food chain, so to speak. But these people had many of them had a lot more influence over what ultimately happened to WCW than I did, right, internally, corporately.
Yeah. There's so much about it out there that the downfall of WCW and these things, so much of it ends up attacks at you. And how do you just kind of just deal with it? I'm at a point, Eric, in my recovery that it's like year 2, everybody said a lot of the shit's going to hit the fan for you, and it is. How do you just kind of navigate a lot of this stuff where it's just a bunch of fodder?
It's taking time. Keep in mind, I was active in the industry for 30 plus years, I guess. And during that period of time, I took a lot of heat, it started out with, why the hell does this guy get this job? Going back to the AWA, when I ended up on camera, right. A lot of the wrestling talent there at that point in time, they didn't really have anything against me, but it was like, who is this new kid that's never spent a nickel or never spent a minute in the wrestling business, has never drawn a nickel, doesn't even know how to lace up a pair of wrestling boots, how is this kid? He doesn't know anybody. He didn't come up in the business. His family wasn't in the business. This Eric Bischoff character just came from out of nowhere and ended up hosting a show on ESPN 5 days a week. How does that happen? There was a resentment about that. Yeah. Because I had no experience. And I understand that. I didn't take that personally. It's kind of comes with the territory. But as things progressed over time, and then I made it to WCW, and kind of the same thing, people kind of recognized I had a little bit more experience by that point, but it was still, I was the outsider. I didn't come up in the wrestling business. I didn't come into the business the way most people did. And as a result, I think inherently there was just a fair amount of, I don't want to call it natural resentment or jealousy, but it was there. Yeah. And then eventually it became, the dirt sheet writers and the rag sheets and people like Dave Meltzer and all, they had their own opinion and their narrative. And then that began to grow. As my profile began to grow, so did the narrative from others. And to top it all off, I became the president of a division of Turner Broadcasting. By the way, I had no corporate experience prior to that. I was a talent, but here I am, president of a division of Turner Broadcasting. That really created some resentment internally by people, in the company that kind of felt that they deserved that. Sure. And of course they would leak things to people like Dave Meltzer, and, they had their own agenda and reasons for doing it. And it just grew and grew and grew. But it bothered me a lot, to be honest with you, early on. And when I say bothered me, like I didn't go home and, whine about it or complain to my wife about it or, sit and be miserable about it. My nature is to fight back. I'll come back at you. I'll counterpunch. My nature is to fight first and then start thinking about things later.
That's got me in trouble a few times.
And here's how that worked out for me, though. By fighting back and calling out certain people. And I've been doing it for a long time. I did it long before social media, became a thing. those people, those individuals who had their own agenda and their own feelings about me, rather than sitting back and shutting up, what did they do? They did what most people would do, is they started coming on even stronger. So I developed this love-hate without the love relationship with these dirt sheet writers, and it just continued to escalate. And throughout my career, no matter what move I made, you always had a group of people like the Dave Meltzers and the amoeba that follow him, or I should say not follow him, but believe him.
Right.
And not just Dave, others, just kind of camped out in that camp. But, I got to the point where it stopped bothering me, and I started having fun with it. Like now I have fun with it. I purposely will sometimes post things on Twitter that I know will, irritate the dirt sheet community. And I do it just for fun. I just like fucking with them. and to a degree, because when they do that stuff, they expose themselves for what little they really know about the industry, and they expose themselves as just being, fanatical anti-Eric Bischoff wrestling dirt sheet readers.
Yeah. And I that's one of the things I love, and no offense to anybody else on the ad-free shows team. Your shows are the ones I listen to the most. I love hearing about, the business of, and it's really interesting you come from that, but also just your approach with life. And one of the really intriguing things to me was when you've talked a lot about, your growing up, and I see where that, I'm like, where does a personality like what I know of you publicly and through mutual friends develop? And you talk about the tough streets of Detroit growing up, in Minnesota, and home life. How do you kind of reflect back on those experiences? Is there ever a time maybe you're sitting there journaling and go, wow, okay, this reminds me when I was younger and, getting beat up as a kid in Detroit or whatever it was. And this is the period I decided I was going to stop taking shit.
Oh, I mean, that, first of all, when I think about my childhood and growing up in Detroit, and I didn't grow up in the roughest part of Detroit, I want to make that clear. Where I grew up in Detroit, it was probably rougher than your average suburban, community, because it was Detroit, and it was different. I did get beat up essentially 3 times a day, 5 days a week. Now, I was a scrawny kid. And the older kids in the neighborhood typically picked on the younger, scrawny kids. And I was among several of those. I wasn't the only one, but it's just the way it was. And to be honest with you, I just thought that's the way life was. I didn't have anything to compare it to. To me, it was, that's how everybody lives. I'm sure this same thing. I didn't think this, but I guess at the time I thought everybody went through what I went through, and that was the way life was everywhere, because I didn't have anything to compare it to. And when I left Detroit, I was a kid, 13, 14 years old, whatever it was. I moved to Pittsburgh. And I remember, I was a new kid, nobody knew who me was. I was still that scrawny kid, nothing changed. And I remember I was on a bus, and I never ridden a bus before, because in Detroit, I walked to school. We lived close enough to school, I could walk. And I'm on this bus, and this kid by the name of Kenny Stockline is his name. He was he was the tough guy. He was the athlete. He was the star quarterback or whatever he was in the football team. And he was the alpha, right? In 8th grade or 7th grade or whatever it was, probably 8th grade, 9th grade. And I remember he was sitting behind me one day on a school bus, and we got dropped off at the same bus stop. And we had shop class back then, metal shop. And this Kenny had made a garden trowel out of sheet metal. That was his class project. And he was bringing it home, I guess. And he was sitting behind me on the bus on the way home. And just to get laughs, I guess, he was binging me on the back of the head. Just ding, not hard, just ding, ding. And everybody behind me would break out laughing. Of course, new kid sitting by himself in front of the bus, getting picked on by the, school bully, but everybody liked him. He was a very popular kid. And, I was here 6, 7, 8 times, I'm getting banged on the back of the head. And I remember thinking, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't. I moved away from it. And I really had hoped that things would be different. And they kind of weren't. I lived in a nicer area. You know, my parents upgraded. They moved to a nicer neighborhood, a nicer house, better school. But here I was again, getting banged on the back of the head with a garden trowel by Kenny Stockline. I remember somewhere along the way, I said, nah, I just don't want to do this anymore. And I waited till the bus stopped at our bus stop. So I had planned this in my head. I just sat there and I let him hit me and I let everybody laugh. Not hit me, but, try to irritate me. And everybody's laughing and I didn't do anything. I didn't even turn around and look at him. Didn't do anything. Didn't sell it. I didn't know what selling was back then. But I knew I had one shot because he was
Eric, a lot of wrestlers now don't either.
Well, I knew, look, he was a bigger, stronger, tougher kid than me. And I knew, okay, I got one shot at this because here's the good news for me at that time. Having fought 3 times a day, generally, I got beat up on my way to school. I got beat up at lunchtime when they took my lunch money. And then I'd usually get beat up at least once on the way home, right? Most days, not every day, but most days, same pattern. But you kind of learn a little bit about street fighting, and even at a young age. So as this cat's banging me on the back of the head, I'm going, okay, here's how this is going to happen, Eric. You only got one shot. Because if you don't take care of this in the first shot, you're going to get your butt kicked. So I just waited and waited and waited. And when we came to our bus stop, I waited until I could sense, maybe I was cheated a little bit, looked out of the corner of my eye. And when I saw this kid, Kenny, stand up behind me, and he was reaching for his books or something, I just stood up as quick as I could and turned around and sucker punched him. And then there was a big, the bus driver, because I was really at the front of the bus, and the bus driver got involved and threw us off the bus and all that. And then there was a big pull apart. Anyway, fast forward, Kenny called me out. He said, all right, Alcoma Golf Course. And Alcoma Golf Course was a golf course that was right across the street from our bus stop. So he called me out. Well, that was the big news all day long. There's going to be a fight after school. Kenny Stockline, school tough guy. He's going to beat up the new kid. And it's no big deal. I've been beat up so many times. Getting my ass kicked has never been a concern for me because it's happened so often. I've gotten used to it at that point. And I showed up and I thought, I'm going to fight ugly. I'm not going to stand here and try to box and do what kids usually do, try to prove, show off. I just went at him, and dropped him. I didn't hit him. I didn't drop him with a punch. Somehow we were wrestling around. He went down on all fours. And when he went down on all fours, before he got up, I stood back and I just football punched him right in the ribs. And that was that. That was the end of that fight. And from that day forward, I never got picked on again. Mm-hmm. Nobody thought of me as the tough guy because I was still the scrawny kid. But I was the scrawny kid from Detroit that beat the hell out and embarrassed, the tough guy. And I think that moment kind of is what made me go, okay. It's better to fight back than it is just to take people's shit.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the more formative moments in my young life that has carried over. I still feel that way. I still react, I don't take a lot of shit from people, even from people I like. I don't. But I've calmed down quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm guessing that Lori, Mrs. Bischoff helps with that a little bit because, like, before we started recording, one of the things that I really take away from 83 Weeks when you talk about her, and I had this conversation with Holly Saunders on here, her boyfriend's Oscar De La Hoya, and she talked about, a relationship. You can have someone and it'll fuck up your life real bad, but you get the right person and your life becomes enhanced. And I hear so much, I think you're having some AG1 or something right now. I know Mrs. B's into holistic, health and all these things. I don't know if you've ever thought about doing an episode of 83 Weeks just about her and that relationship, but there's such a beautiful interweaving of having a partner that stood by your side through so much.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever done a full episode, but Lori has certainly, done various podcasts and been a guest, and she has her own podcast, and we've done things together on her podcast. I'm not sure my audience for 83 weeks, because most of them are there to kind of revisit the nostalgia, the Monday Night Wars and all that. I'm not sure they want to hear much about relationship issues in general, maybe a little bit here and there. But look, there's no question, Lori and I have grown up together. When I met Lori, she was 21 years old. She's been with me the majority of her life at this point. And things have evolved. It wasn't like the minute, Lori and I got together, it was this magical, moment and transformation and evolution of things. That wasn't it at all, man. We were kids. She was a kid, basically. I was 6 years older and still a kid, because I think men generally mature at a rate about 8 or 10 years behind women. So although she was only 21 and I was 27, we were essentially about the same age, emotionally, maturity wise. We went through, there was a lot of things that we did that were, uncharacteristic of our lifestyle now. Because it just happens as you get older. You get older, you have kids, your values change, you mature, you learn by experience, and you start eliminating some of the bad habits or bad choices or, parts of your lifestyle that aren't necessarily productive. And you start focusing more on the things that are going to make you happy. Yeah. Now, with Lori, she really kind of dove headfirst into nutrition and her spirituality, probably in the early to mid 90s is when it really started to become her primary focus outside of, taking care of the family and the kids. And that her intensity for that only grew over time. And it slowly, and I want to really emphasize slowly, started to affect me, and her interest in nutrition. I've always had a strong interest in nutrition. I think she'll tell you one of the things that kicked off Lori's interest in nutrition was a book that I gave her called Sugar Blues. And when she read that book, it was kind of like an eye opener for her, and it was the catalyst for her to really dig into nutrition. And then along with that, her spirituality. She began to really explore and read and invest, because Lori wasn't really a spiritual person when I met her. If she was, I never knew it. She was a 21-year-old, average, well, anything but average, hot as hell. But I mean, in terms of her personality and the things she did and enjoyed. But as that part of her life became more important to her, obviously it became a bigger part of my life. But it's taken time, man. I mean, I'll be 68 in May, and I feel like I'm just now getting to, I don't want to say understand, but embrace spirituality and embrace kind of a bigger, I hate to use the word enlightened because it's used so much, but a bigger, broader view of the world beyond just the next opportunity I'm going to try to tackle.
It's funny when you talk about yours and the Mrs. age difference. My partner and I, she's 16 years younger, and I've had people go, "Whoa, how does that work?" I go, "You got to remember, I was drunk for over a decade every day. So, my emotional maturity was stunted quite a bit." So
that has a lot to do with it, right? It's not like you really evolve as a human being when you're under the influence of anything. It doesn't have to be chemicals. You can be under the influence of any kind of lifestyle that doesn't even necessarily involve alcohol or drugs. But if you're obsessed with things to the point where, or you allow things, whatever it may be, to control you to the point where you're not exploring your spirituality and a bigger view of the world, then you kind of stunt it. It's like no growth.
Oh yeah, no, there was none whatsoever. I was a shit show, to be honest, but but you've seen it. I mean, our connection here, this is the irony too of being an avid listener of your show, I learned about Tim Ryan, Dope Man, the work you did with Jason Hervey because of 83 Weeks. Now, 2 years, almost 2 years, Tim and I have been friends. What did doing that show really kind of change your perception of addiction? I mean, because you were around, it's, Scott Hall, one of my all-time favorite wrestling performers, and how did really going through that, did your mindset concerning addiction maybe change?
I'll be honest, the show had nothing to do with that. I was barely involved. I was involved on the business side of that show. My business partner, Jason Hervey, was working directly with Tim throughout that whole process. I never even stepped on the set because I was busy producing other things, and that was Jason's project. I didn't really get to know Tim until after that project was over and aired on A&E, and a certain amount of time went by, and one day Tim Ryan reached out to me and said, hey, by that time, Jason Hervey and I had dissolved our production company, amicably, we're still friends, but he kind of went his way and I went my way. And then Tim called me one day and said, hey, I'd really like to get this show going. I know, had a special on A&E, but I think it could be a series. So I started working closely with Tim on that. But the show didn't have any impact on me, to be honest, because I already had a pretty strong opinion about addiction. And because of working with guys like Scott Hall, but he was only one.
Right.
If I look back, I don't even like to think about it, the number of people that I worked with, peers, guys a lot younger than me, that I worked with and had different levels of relationships with, that all died because of drugs. I saw it. I saw what alcohol did to people. I've been around people for the better part of 30 years that, you sit down with them and shoot the shit and everything's great. And they're fun people and they're fun to be around. You go out and you have a drink with them. And for the first 2 or 3 drinks, they're a good time and everybody's laughing. By drink number 4, they turn into mean people. They get bitter and angry and mean. And I've been around people I'm not exaggerating. I've been around people that went from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde over the course of 3 beers. And when you see that happen in front of you, you go, what the hell? It doesn't take a very intelligent person at all to realize that, man, some people shouldn't drink.
Yeah.
And obviously people shouldn't, I watch guys, Louis Spicoli, young guy, wrestled, for WCW, passed away. Ray Traylor, another good friend of mine, took my son deer hunting. My son got his very first deer with Ray Traylor and Rick Steiner. Ray Traylor passed away because he was drinking and doing somas.
Yeah.
A muscle relaxer. It was a bad combination. And that combination of alcohol and prescription drugs has probably killed more of my friends than anything. And I was well aware of that. Now, what I wasn't aware of until after getting to know Tim was the extent of the opioid crisis. Yeah. And how heroin made its resurgence. When I was a teenager in the 60s and early 70s, I knew what heroin was. Everybody knew what heroin was, but the people that did heroin were like the destitute, bottom of the barrel, homeless, they were a different class of, it wasn't like smoking weed and mushrooms and having fun. These were people that were like into the poison. Well, I realized after meeting Tim and having conversations with Tim that heroin was no longer a junkie's disease initially. Yeah. It was a blue collar disease. It was a white collar disease. There was heroin everywhere. And then I learned that one of the reasons that heroin is everywhere is because doctors in the pharmaceutical industry were overprescribing opioids in the form of Vicodin and Percocet and all the other goodies for so long. And when those drugs became no longer so easily available because the federal government finally realized that, all of a sudden they shut down the supply of heroin, the pain clinics that existed in Florida. I've seen them, when they existed, before Florida cracked down on pain clinics. You could literally walk in, and I've done it, by the way, one of my favorite cocktails back in the day was what was called a starter kit. A starter kit was a Vicodin of a substantial strength. I don't remember what the milligrams were anymore, but a substantially strong Vicodin, along with 2 mini thins. Mini thins were the little caffeine stimulants you could buy over the counter at 7-Eleven. And then you mix 2 mini thins of Vicodin and about 3 or 4 beers, and you were off for a fun ride for a while until you weren't, until you started doing too much of it. And so I know how easy it was to go in and get a prescription for Vicodin.
Yeah.
Wow, man, I sprained my elbow, doc. Can I get some Vicodin? Oh yeah, here's 120. Here's a prescription of 120. Let me know if you need a refill. You go to the dentist, get a tooth pulled. Oh, here's 30 Vicodin. Well, I've had a whole bunch of dental work done recently, implants and all kinds of other stuff. I never took a pain pill. The last time I never even took an aspirin because you don't need it. Yeah. But when doctors would just give it to you, what do most people do? Oh, fuck, I'll try it, see what that's like. But when all that shut down and you couldn't get it anymore, that's when the heroin industry started really growing, becoming.
Yeah, and it's one of those situations of following the money with this. I work for a nonprofit called Parents and Addicts in Need, and the founder, he was an opioid addict. And so him and Tim Ryan have hit it off really well. But it was that doctor shopping and everything else. He was fortunate enough that he was upstanding enough in the city that he lives that he didn't have to ever resort to going to the streets. But it was that close. I mean, it was that close. And it's, I'm one of those oddballs with addiction, Eric. I've tried a lot of different stuff, cocaine. Oh, I got paranoid the first time. Opioids made me sick, thank goodness. But boy, I wasn't the angry drunk unless it was a situation. What do you mean there's not a 5th beer? That's when it would set me off. As long as I kept drinking, I was pretty good. And there wasn't anyone that was poking at me, kind of like the young man with the hoe on the back of your head. I was pretty good, but boy, I would definitely kill for that 5th beer. And for me, that was when it was, even growing up in a home of addiction, didn't understand it. I thought it was weakness. I thought my dad was weak until I got older and went, oh shit, okay, now I know what he means, that son, you need to look out. Because I've had family members on both sides die from this disease.
Yeah, it's so insidious, right? It creeps up on you. So, well, I'm just speaking for myself and my experience, not only my experience individually, but my experience being in the business I was in, where, prescription drug abuse was commonplace for a long time. It starts out kind of just fun. Not going to hurt anybody else. The doctor gave it to me. It's a prescription. Therefore, it's okay. And you don't realize what it does to you, man. And it's like, the more I read about, and not just, heroin and opioids and alcohol and the other things that are out there that people have problems with, but the one that scares me the most, because I think it's even more insidious and we haven't yet begun to understand how much it's affected people for generations now, is drugs like Ritalin. Yeah. And drugs for ADD, which I think in some respects is become a manufactured condition that's been created by a part of the medical community. They create a problem, convince people they have the problem because they have a drug for it.
Yeah.
And you have to go to that doctor to get that drug. And when I hear about kids who are being diagnosed as, attention deficit disorder, I'm going, they're fucking kids.
Yeah, right?
They're fucking kids. They have the attention span of a fruit fly. And rather than dealing with that, some kids more than others, rather than dealing with it, it's like, oh, let's just give them a pill because the parents are too busy to deal with it, or they don't know how.
Yeah.
They've got a full-time job. They've got their own pressures. They got their own issues. And man, it's a lot easier to go to the doctor and say, oh, well, young Billy here, he's got ADD. It's fairly common. Just give him 2 of these, give him 1 in the morning, 1 at night. He'll be fine. Shit. It's wicked stuff, man. It's wicked stuff because it changes, I believe. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an expert. I'm not Tim Ryan. I'm not you. But I've had my own experience with it individually and seeing it around me. And I firmly believe that those drugs that are designed to rewire your brain and create different chemical processes in your brain also rewire your brain and make you into a different person. I've seen that. I've experienced that too.
It totally is messing with your neural pathways. And so you take, you're pointing out some really great stuff. So you take, the brain, they say, matures around 26. So any of this stuff, and you are fucking with your neural pathways, connections that you can and should be made, especially with kids, like you're saying, with Ritalin and things like that. And let's even introduce, I kid of the 80s, born 78, but, so pot, even take that. We're seeing now, 15, 16, 17-year-olds having psychotic breaks from the high THC content. In addition to the fentanyl crisis, that's a whole nother fucking story altogether, Eric. I mean, there's not even experimentation with that. You think you're getting a Xanax, you're not. You got a pill that's pure fentanyl and you're gone first time. So it's a scary situation, as a father of 2 teenagers and really educating them to, you got to look out for yourself. I know you're going to be curious, but curiosity could be that you're gone.
Yeah. I look back and I'm so grateful, that I hate to say I'm grateful that I'm the age that I am because we all wish that we were younger in some respects. But when I was in my 20s and early 30s, I'm not going to lie. If I was out with a couple of my friends and somebody had, an 8-ball or had a gram, and it was like, oh, take a line before we go out drinking, I'm in. I'd do that. It was fun. I didn't have any problem with that. It was like, whoa, let's go have a great time. And it's one of the things I'm grateful for, because I realized after a short period of time, I don't like this stuff. I like that momentary buzz that I got. It was fun. There's no denying it. It was a great feeling of euphoria and energy, until it wasn't a couple hours later. And then you feel like crap. And the next day you feel worse. It's like, okay, I get it, but I don't want to keep getting it, And for me, cocaine was an experiment, but I never got into it, and in a serious way, mostly because I couldn't afford it, but partly because I realized early on that, you get a momentary rush out of it, but you get a much longer period of feeling like crap. Yeah. And I never liked feeling like crap. I always liked feeling good.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to being a determined individual. I that's kind of a thread I've taken throughout, and following your career, of course. At one time when I was going to school for film and television, my dream was not to be a commentator for WWE, but WCW. Well, prior to the year 2000, let's be honest. But I've just seen this determination, whereas for me, growing up in a home of addiction, very disjointed relationship from my dad, some abuse there. I was like 5 or 6 being exposed to hardcore pornography. Granted, now that he's sober, beautiful person, different relationship altogether. I was always looking for something kind of filling a void. And that's the thing I've noticed between people just such as yourself. I went out, had fun. It was a good time with the buddies. For me, it was always looking to fill something that wasn't there. And the delusion in my own mind that, especially, 4 or 5 beers in, I could talk to any woman in the bar. Everybody wanted to hang out with me. I'm the local radio celeb and what other bullshit. So it's interesting how for the non-addicts, so to speak, there is some different language in their reflection upon any experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I guess there is. We've all had different relationships with experimenting with drugs, and some people go from experiment. I mean, everybody's got a different reason why they do what they do. I mean, there's a reason why people. There's a million reasons why, I guess.
Yeah.
People become alcoholics. Everybody's got, with you, it was a void you were trying to fill. Who knows? Everybody's got a different reason. Usually it ties back to trauma or not feeling worthy or not feeling loved or whatever that is. Those are things that I think are common amongst addicts. I don't know. I'm not in the
Nope.
community.
Nailed it.
I don't counsel people. But I read and I talk to people. I listen. And it seems like that's like the common denominator, man. Just not feeling loved, not feeling important, or in some cases, even more severe trauma, abuse of one form or another.
Yeah. Well, I exchanged with you sharing that my dad unfortunately had an accident. I think it's 5 years ago now, quadriplegic. But you went through some of that stuff too with your father with some health issues. Did that? For me, it's motivated me to change my life, to get better, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, in all ways. Did it have an impact on you, maybe in reflection, the things that were going on with your dad, to kind of?
Well, fill in the blanks for people that don't know. My dad, when I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, so this must have been about 1960. I remember the morning. It was around 1960 because I was looking at my mom and dad leaving the driveway of our home in Detroit, and they got into our 59 Ford Fairlane. I remember it. It was beige and white with a green interior. It was the ugliest fucking car on the block. But I remember being about 5 years old and sitting up on the couch and looking out the picture window, the main window in our home, and watching my mom and dad drive off as my mom was taking my father to the hospital for brain surgery. And my dad was born premature. Believe it or not, he was born in 1930, but even in 1930, he was only 3.5 pounds when he was born.
Wow.
Now, and he was born in a farmhouse, probably 60 miles from the nearest hospital. Maybe not quite that far, 40. But nonetheless, he was born in a farmhouse. My grandmother gave birth to him in the farmhouse, and he was premature. And they kept him warm by putting him in a dresser drawer filled with blankets with a heat lamp. That's how they kept him alive and nurtured him. And it's amazing back in 1930, having that happen in a farmhouse without any medical attention, that he even survived, to be honest. But he did. But by the time he was in his 20s now, around 1959 or 1960, when he was born prematurely, his spine had not fully developed. So there was essentially a hole, if you will, or pocket at the very top of his spine that had not completely fused or completed its growth cycle before he was born. And over the years, cerebral fluid from his brain would leak into the spine and would kind of build up in that pocket or that hole in his spine. And over the years, it became significant enough that it was putting pressure on certain nerves. And he was having these excruciating, debilitating headaches as a result, which is why he went in for the brain surgery. Now, prior to that morning, when they took him to the hospital, my dad was a very physical guy. Even at 5 years old or whatever I was, my dad would take me pheasant hunting with him and my uncles and my cousins. I didn't get to do it. I just got to walk along, and be a part of the group to the best of my ability. But he always brought me with him. Took me fishing. He was a very physical, growing up on a farm. He loved to fish. He loved to hunt. He was just a physical guy. He loved to work with his hands. He built the house we lived in. With his own two hands and along with a friend of his. That was my dad. Well, when my dad came back from the hospital, he no longer had use of his arms or his hands. That was a pretty traumatic thing. Now, I'm 5 or 6 years old. I don't know what's going on. My dad's home. I don't realize that he can't use his hands any longer. I don't realize how emasculated he felt, because this is the 60s. This was back when you don't let your wife go to work. What kind of husband are you if your wife has to work? She stays home. She takes care of the kids. She does the cooking and the cleaning. That was it. It was Ozzie and Harriet, man. It was Leave It to Beaver. It wasn't, two career households.
Right.
If you had a wife that had to work, you were looked down upon, So my dad could no longer brush his own teeth. Couldn't comb his own hair. Forget about building anything. Going hunting and fishing, that's not off the table. He couldn't put on a pair of socks by himself. And what I didn't realize, and unfortunately, this is the one thing I don't regret much of my life. I don't regret much. There's things I would do differently, but I can't allow myself to regret anything really, because I wouldn't be where I am today if I did. And I look at things that were negative in my life at any point in time as a growth opportunity or an experience, and I grew from it. But with my dad and my mom, as a young kid, you don't realize psychologically what that does to a person. Someone like my dad in the 60s, who was totally dependent upon my mom and his mother, because my grandmother moved in with us to help. Emasculating.
Yeah.
And my dad became bitter and angry. He tried his best. He really did. And he did a lot of great things as a dad. But there were a lot of things that weren't so great. And there was, I don't want to call it abuse. It was never physical. Well, yeah, it was, but not in the way people think. And I was angry. I couldn't wait to get out of the house. Couldn't wait to make my own money. I started working when I was 8 or 9 years old. Odd jobs in the neighborhood. Always had a paper route. When I got old enough to drive a car, I always had a job. Because I couldn't wait to be independent of my mother and father, because I was kind of miserable because they were miserable as a result of what my dad had to go through. My dad was horrible to my mom. He didn't mean to be. He didn't even know he was, but he was horrible to my mom because he took a lot of his frustration out on me, but a lot of it on her, because I was the oldest, right?
Yeah.
And he took a lot of it out on her. And I saw that. I saw the mental abuse, the emotional abuse. And I experienced it myself. Nothing I could ever do was ever good enough for my dad. Ever good enough for my dad. And that was his frustration in him, not in me. But I didn't know that till, I'm in my 50s and I go, God, now I get why dad was the way he was. And I really appreciate my mother more than I ever did when she was alive. Because now, as I look back and I have my own kids and they're adults, I look back and I think, man, my mom was like a fucking hero. And my dad was too in his own way, because he tried. He provided, even though he was paralyzed, he didn't have a college education. He grew up on a farm. But he, I don't want to say excelled, but, he died. When he died at 70 years old, he was an executive at a pretty big, company, and had carved out a niche for himself despite, oh, by the way, he was blind in one eye too. Despite, all the things that were going against him, he provided a great life for my mom and me and my brother and sister.
Yeah.
But like you, brother, I don't mean to interrupt you, but like you, when you look at your dad and what happened to your dad as kind of your inspiration, I look at what my mom and dad went through as an inspiration too, because first and foremost, they loved their kids and they took care of their kids, and family was number one.
Yeah.
And that to me has probably shaped my life as much as anything.
Yeah. I almost got choked up there, because you talking about that made me think back, because, my childhood was when my dad was active in his addiction, and about my mom just really holding it together. Granted, my dad didn't even finish high school, lived on his own by 14, was incredibly hardworking. I mean, became a millionaire at one point, and, all these things. It's thank you for that vulnerability on that. That brought me some comfort, if that sounds a little odd. You were talking about being a parent, but no, you guys are grandparents now.
Yeah. You know what? A funny story about that. And again, this is just life or mine, I should say, not everybody else's. But Garrett and his wife, they've been wanting to have a baby for quite a while. They worked at it pretty hard, right? It didn't come easy. Let's put it that way. And when they first told us, we're going to try to have a kid, which is not surprising because my son, I think he was born to be a father. I really do. So it didn't surprise me, but I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I hope I feel the same way about being a grandparent as everybody else that I talk to. Like everybody would say to me, oh, wait till you have a grandkid. It's going to change your life. You think having kids was fun. Wait till you have a grandchild. And I would always go, I don't know. Maybe, or maybe not. Because I had so much fun being a dad. I couldn't imagine having a feeling that was any more powerful than being a dad. So when people would say, oh, yeah, that's great, but it's going to get better, I would go, I don't know. Maybe for you, but I don't know. And deep down inside, I always had this kind of fear. It's like, well, what if I don't feel that same way? What if I'm like cool with it, but I don't have that overwhelming sense of gratitude and joy that I hear so many people talking about? I just didn't see it for me until Waylon was born and I saw him. And if I think about it, I'll start crying like a bitch. It's just, and I went, okay, I get it.
I love
it's true. And it's not that it's better than being a parent, but it's so much different. It has all of the benefits in terms of joy, but the added value for me is not only do I have the joy of watching this little creature evolve, and he's evolving. We were there, over Christmas break, and it's like he's got his own personality now. He's got his own sense of humor now. I mean, he's just an amazing kid. And to be able to watch that happen before your eyes is just so cool. But seeing the joy that my son and his wife are experiencing is what elevates this experience from having kids. Because now I'm watching my kids experience the joy of having a child, which I never contemplated. I didn't think about that part. I didn't realize how important that would be or how much impact that would have on me. So it's pretty cool.
Eric, before we get to some random questions and I give you the floor for some final thoughts, please, the new book, Grateful, how can people get it? 83 weeks, strictly business, ad-free shows, whatever you want to let people know about, please.
Yeah, just it's available on Amazon. Go to amazon.com, / Eric Bischoff, and it'll come up. Or you can go to bischoffbook.com, which will take you to Amazon. It's available. The book was a fun experience, man. Guy did a great job. Guy listened to the podcast, and Guy was the one that approached me and said, "Hey, I listen to your podcast, and I hear some of the things you're saying, and I know you're just talking about wrestling, but I hear some of the other stuff you're talking about." And he said, "I think you've got a story to tell or something to offer." And I was not resistant at first. I just didn't see it. I didn't see what he saw. But as we talked through it, I went, okay, that would be kind of cool because it's different and it's a part of my life or part of me that I don't typically share. I'm usually just talking about wrestling bullshit. So I thought, well, this will be a fun experience. And it really was. It was cathartic in some respects, and it was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed doing it. But the book is out there, and it's not a self-help book. I'm not trying to convince anybody I know how to make them better. It's really just my experience. And if there's anything in my experience that makes people go, yeah, I get that, and makes them think, that's my goal. Just think, man. If you read this book and it makes you think a little differently about something, then that's a good thing.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to reading it, and I'm also looking forward. You guys did something that I don't know of any other book that's done it. At the end of each chapter, there's a QR code for supplemental multimedia material that coincides with it. I thought that was a really brilliant move.
Yeah, and I'd like to take credit for that, but it would be a lie. I have a friend who is a writer, and he's a professor in California. His name is Brad Balukjian. Balukjian. I'm looking at a document I have on my computer from. Brad is a writer, professor in California, college professor. But he's a big baseball fan, and he wrote a book called The Wax Pack, where he went off on this journey because of a breakup in his life and heartbroken and frustrated and whatever, and just decided, I'm going to go on a road trip and I'm going to go find all of the people that is in this deck of baseball cards I bought when I was a kid. And he proceeded to go on this road trip, and he found some of these folks and he interviewed them, and he wrote a book about that experience.
Wow.
And he had an idea for a book that he's currently writing called The Six Pack, which is essentially the same thing, but it's about a lot of professional wrestlers who were all involved at Madison Square Garden the night that I think Hulk Hogan beat Andre the Giant or something like that. It was a big moment in wrestling. So he went on a road trip and sat down and interviewed all these guys last year. And through that process, because Brad wanted to interview me and solicit a little bit of help on my end. And we got to talking, and I told him I was writing a book, and he says, man, because I got this idea, because I can't do it with my book because he's going through a traditional publisher. We're self-publishing through Amazon, so we can do whatever we want. And his publisher wasn't interested in it. But I said, what's your idea? And he goes, well, I want to do a QR code, and that QR code will take you to an in-depth interview with whoever was the subject of that chapter. I went, ooh, wait a minute. I could do that in my book. So I asked him, I said, Brad, do you mind if I steal your idea? He goes, no, please do it. Let's see how it works. So it was not my idea, but I've gained the benefit of being the first book that has ever been published that has ever used QR codes for supplemental bonus video content to support each chapter. Now, other people have used QR codes for technical information or to go to a website so you can, look at a schematic of something, but nobody's ever used it to provide video content with the subject of a book. And I think it's very cool. Amanda, we talked, it's our common denominator here. Amanda did I watched it and I started crying. If you can't tell, I'm a fairly emotional person when it's real, Yeah. She's an amazing person, but there's a lot, Lex Luger's in there and tells his story about he and I and how we found each other again after wrestling, after, Elizabeth Hewitt, Miss Elizabeth literally died in his arms of a drug overdose, and my resentment towards him because of that. And just one day I woke up and went, I got to call Lex Luger. And I've never been friends with Lex. I mean, we worked together and did everything against him, but we never hung out, never talked on the phone, never had dinner, never went out for a beer, anything like that. All the time we worked together. Just one day, after years of despising him and resenting him and blaming him, which wasn't all his fault, but, one day I just woke up and said, I got to call Lex Luger. I just have to. And I did. And it was a turning point for me because it taught me about forgiveness and it taught me about being judgmental. It's really easy for me, especially, to be judgmental. I think it's for all of us. That's why Twitter's such a cesspool.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, everything. Our culture has become so judgmental.
Yeah.
And, after talking to Lex on the phone the first time, I was like, I'm a Christian. I don't go to church every Sunday, and I'm not what most people would consider to be a highly spiritual person, but I think I am in my way. My church is the mountains, going for a hike with my dog. That's when I talk to God, is when I'm outside. But that conversation with Lex, I just, judge not lest you be judged. Well, how can you profess to be a Christian and have that faith and at the same time judge people? And when I hung up the phone, and that's the first thought that popped through my head was judge not lest you be judged. I went, man, you spend a lot of time judging people.
Mm-hmm.
I did. And I went, well, that's fucked up. That's not the right thing. And I, just because I try and I'm not that great at it, I'm working on that. It's a day-to-day process for me because my go-to is to be judgmental and defensive. And in certain situations. But then you start thinking about, well, how can I do that and profess to be a Christian? And then start looking at yourself and all the stupid shit I've done. And
right.
Oh man, I want to get out of this frame of mind because this is not right. It's just not. So but it's all in the book, man. And you'll hear it from Lex Luger. You'll hear it from me. You'll read it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm glad that you've unloaded that baggage. Shit's too heavy to carry, man.
Well, that's the other thing too, and even, you talked before about how do you deal with all the negativity and people do that. And it's that too, that's just baggage. If I allow that stuff to live inside of my head, or if I carry it around, now I'll still react to it. If somebody says something that I know is false or whatever, I'll clarify, for the record. But once I do, it's gone.
Yeah.
I don't think about it. I don't go to bed at night thinking about it. Why did that person say that? I don't give a fuck. But I've quit worrying about that stuff because you do, whether you realize it, whether I realized it or not, I shouldn't say you. For me, I realized that carrying resentment like I had with Lex, that was a big one, but there's a lot of little ones you just collect throughout the course of a day. You don't even know you're packing it into your bag.
Yeah.
You are, though, subconsciously or sometimes consciously. You're just packing that resentment into a bag. And before you know it, that bag weighs more than you do.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not doing you any good. It's slowing you down big time.
Oh no! Hey, to silence that bullshit, I would crawl into a 30-pack. So that was my character defect. I know exactly what you're talking about, Eric. For those listening or watching, all the links for Eric's book, his website, social media are there in the podcast description. So go ahead and click that. Give Eric a follow. Because you drop some other stuff that's not wrestling that I absolutely love, especially your personal Instagram, seeing you with your family. It's like, I'm a softie with that stuff. So, all right, here we go. Some random questions for you. Pet peeves, shit that just irks you on a daily.
People being late.
Mm.
It's my pet peeve. If someone sets a meeting with me, and I make the effort to be on time. And by the way, almost always will be early. As I was 5 minutes late for this interview, so there's that.
But you didn't get the email link, right?
I couldn't find the link. You probably sent it, but I couldn't find it. But I respect people's time. That's an easy thing to disrespect, right?
Yeah.
I used to have a business partner that would intentionally show up 5 or 10 minutes late for every meeting, to give the perception that he was a very busy person. It used to drive me batshit because I look at it the opposite. Like if I set a meeting with someone, if I'm discussing business or I have a presentation I want to make or something, and somebody else arranges their day so that they're available and somebody shows up 10 or 15 minutes late, you've essentially told everybody in that room that you're way more important than they are. Yeah. Very disrespectful. At least that's the way I view it.
Yeah.
And because of that, I tend to be always early. So when people are late, it just, pet peeve.
If you could have dinner with any one person, living or not, who would they be?
You know what's ironic about that one? Is I've already had dinner with him, but I wanted to do it again. I spent a fair amount of time, 4 or 5 days, with Muhammad Ali. And I'm so disappointed in myself for not making better use of that time. I was kind of in awe. He's always been, larger than life to me. I grew up listening to, my first experience to Muhammad Ali was before he became Muhammad Ali, and he was Cassius Clay. And my dad and I sitting in the living room in Detroit, sometime in the early 60s, early 60s, listening to the fight when Cassius Clay beat Sonny Liston, and had always been a fan of Muhammad Ali growing up. And then to have the opportunity to travel to Pyongyang, North Korea, of all places, with Muhammad Ali and sit next to him on the flight from Tokyo to Pyongyang, and to spend time with him over there and get to know him on a personal basis it's my greatest, when I think about my career and what's the one moment that I wouldn't trade for anything. And it was that. And now learning more about Muhammad Ali, because I continue to read about him and see old interviews. I'd love to sit down with him one more time, and I will somewhere down the line. But Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, a gentleman that's become a friend of mine, Darren Prince. He managed Ali for signings and stuff near the end of his life, and I mean, the affection he would speak for him would bring him to tears every time.
I know Darren real well. In fact,
okay.
I introduced Darren to Tim.
Oh, okay. It's
I'm the one that connected
world,
those two.
Right?
Yeah,
such a small world. I got two people that I would like you to maybe share something that is not that is misunderstood about them. One of them is Hulk Hogan, and the other one is a gentleman I'd love to speak with if he has the time, Conrad Thompson. What's something about those gentlemen through your friendships with them that people may not understand?
Especially with Hulk, there's a lot, but I think Hulk is one of the kindest, most generous. I'm not just talking about with money, that too, but generous with his time, generous with his attention. He's one of the most generous people I've ever met. And, the rap on Hulk Hogan in the wrestling industry is that he's self-serving and selfish. And there's nothing more opposite of who Terry Bollea is. Now, in the business of professional wrestling, if you're not protective of your character, if you don't mind your own business and put your character in your business as the most important thing in any discussion, there are a world of sharks that are willing to take it away from you to benefit themselves. So yeah, business-wise, the character Hulk Hogan, the man Terry Bollea, could be tough to do business with from time to time. But the person Terry Bollea is one of the kindest, most gentle people I've ever met. I don't think he'd step on a fly. Yeah. I mean, he's just a gentle person and a kind and generous one. Yeah. Conrad, Conrad doesn't have the kind of reputation that Hulk Hogan has, obviously.
Sure.
But what people don't know about Conrad is how special of a human being he is. And my first meeting with Conrad Thompson did not go well.
Okay.
And we talked about it about it in the book, right?
Okay.
I'm not going to give it away here. It was anything but an ideal meeting for either one of us. And what I learned about Conrad is he is a magnet. He's a magnet for really good people. If you look at the team that surrounds Conrad on a day-to-day basis, of which he is the nucleus, he's like a planet that attracts really positive people and good people. Really good people. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people quite understand, a little bit like Hulk Hogan, just how generous Conrad is with his spirit and with his support, and just his sheer nature is positive. So if you happen to be around him, if you're a halfway decent person, you're going to walk up being a better than a halfway decent person because of him. There's not a lot of people like that.
Yeah. One last question before I leave you with the final thoughts. If you could have one superpower, what would it be and why?
superpower. I don't know. I used to think it would be, I wanted to read into the future, but I don't anymore. I don't care about I care about the future, but I don't dwell on it. I don't think about it. I don't worry about it. I worry about today, and I have certain concerns about the future, but I wouldn't want to be able to predict it because I think that would be horrible to know. Superpower. I don't know. I can't even answer that one.
Well,
I guess I don't want one.
Here's my recommendation, being that you do travel a lot for the, live shows and everything else that you do. I would totally take that flight thing and say, fuck you, TSA. I'm not dealing with you anymore.
Oh no, having a private plane isn't a superpower.
Oh, I meant you personally be able to fly. Just like Superman, hitch everything up and fly.
Oh, okay. Well, I know when you said fly, because I used to have my own plane and I was a pilot. I had my instrument rating and I'd fly myself all over the country. And so I thought that's what you're referring to. But, oh no, man, if I could just, throw on a cape and jump off my deck and find myself in, New York or LA or Chicago and not have to deal with shit. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Eric, thank you so much for this. I will share it here with everyone. I have not pursued to speak with someone since I started this podcast longer. So this is one of those vision board things. So
sorry about that.
No, it's not your fault. It's just part of how it goes. You're a busy man, and it's just weird how life came together through mutual friends. If there's anything you would want to lend to people, be it from your own personal experience and how you've seen, how you've had to persevere, everyone's facing something. What might you lend?
I think the one thing I've learned, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book Grateful, is, you got to start somewhere. I had to start somewhere. Again, I'm not trying to convince people to change their lives, but for me, to quit being judgmental, to quit worrying about the future, to quit doing all the things that I think were really holding me back, I had to literally learn how to be grateful. And by that, I mean, everybody's grateful for something that's big and obvious, right? But it's not the big and obvious things that matter all the time. It's learning how to get up in the morning and go, wow, I'm healthy. How many people do I know that aren't? I'm perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with me. Every joint in my body works as well as it did 20 or 25 years ago. I have no aches. I have no pains. I have no conditions. I'm perfectly healthy, and I'm fairly reasonably intelligent. I can do anything because I'm healthy, and being grateful for your health, I think, is what started me. And then, wow, it's a beautiful, look at that sunrise. That sunrise is never going to happen again. It's never going to look exactly the way that it looks right now. And it's beautiful. And I'm grateful to be able to sit here and enjoy it. And when you start learning, when I started learning how to become grateful for the little things, it's like all the negative shit just disappeared and it just evaporated. All the garbage that I carried around in my head, and the resentment, and the anger, and the frustration, and the weird, and the fear, and the all that shit just started. It's like somebody took a valve in the back of my head, and just let it out. Just poosh. Okay, the more I'm grateful, the better I feel. The better I feel, the more I'm grateful. The more I'm grateful, the better I feel. Bam! So be grateful for the little shit and build on it.
This is the Knockin Doorz Down podcast.